or whether it be the way that you share information with that vendor and those organizations that you work with. And that's really what we're going to focus on today. I mean, from a cyber risk perspective, we could talk for days. There's a lot of different topics we could cover, but today we're really focusing on vendor cyber risk and what you can do to help reduce that risk to your organization based on the vendors that you work with. And we'll talk a little bit about what Broadview Networks has done to reduce that risk for our customers as well. One of the first things we want to go over is we are using the Teams webinar format. So if you want to comment or ask a question either along the way or at the end, please type a comment into the chat window or raise your hand so that we know that you want to ask a question. If you're okay with asking the question audio, we can turn your microphone on when you want to ask questions. Just raise your hand, we'll turn your microphone on and go ahead and ask. If you'd rather just do it by text, then you can just, of course, use the chat window to ask any questions. And thank you all very much for attending today. So as I mentioned, we're going to talk about some real-world examples. We're going to talk about the different types of risks. And then we're going to get into the framework for evaluating risk. And we're focusing that framework today on more the vendor cyber risk portion, but the framework that we've chosen to use is the CIS assessment framework. John is certified in CIS. He's also has a number of other certifications, which we can speak to in a bit as well. Having a framework to base your security posture of your organization and understanding of what your security is, where you're strong, where you're weak, basically a gap analysis of security in your organization. We need a guidebook to follow, and that's really what the framework does. And one of the reasons we chose CIS is it's not tied to any single country. It's not tied to any single organization. The Center for Internet Security is a worldwide, open to the public organization of security professionals coming together and developing frameworks. We've leveraged and utilized content from different frameworks from different countries. The UK is quite well known for theirs. Australia is quite well known for theirs. The US NIST is quite popular as a security framework. The CIS framework, we like it because it's global. It's not tied to any specific country. We'll talk about the vendor security assessments and the questionnaires that go with them and how we understand what a customer's security posture is and how we understand the vendor risk. And there's time at the end for a discussion. So, if you have questions, if they're timely in the moment with the content that's being presented at that time, go ahead and ask right away. If you want to wait till the end, that's perfectly fine as well. And we'd certainly like that to be a discussion. So, we like this format to be as open as possible. So please don't hesitate to comment or ask questions along the way. And I'll pass it over to John.
Thank you, Tyson, and good morning, everyone. I'm just going to turn my camera off here because the Teams mode in PowerPoint presentation mode is a little busy on a single screen. So bear with me while I get the slides going. All right. We're going to start with a recap of some of the more significant breaches from 2020 and 21 so far. Each of these breaches and incidents have valuable lessons learned for us all. So starting with Marriott, who, like many organizations, unfortunately, is a repeat offender. They had almost 6 million records exposed when they merged with Starwood. The lesson learned here was we have to keep close tabs on partner franchisee type organizations. Many times, those organizations do not have the same security level as the parent corporation. And of course, while going through a significant merger like that, right, changes take time, planning and implementation takes a significant amount of time to make those kinds of improvements. Secondly, we have General Electric. Over 200,000 employees' personal health information was breached via their document management vendor. The lesson learned here was that our vendors and partners often don't get the same scrutiny as we hold ourselves accountable to. Cloud applications, vendor-hosted applications and data, they contain the same sensitive information as we may have on premise, but they're not getting that same attention and posture improvements. Thirdly, we have to look at companies who hold classified data and are often targets of nation-state hackers. So there's some pretty significant names on the board here: Lockheed, SpaceX, and Tesla. Exploiting third parties, particularly smaller third parties in the SMB space, is the way to get to these larger organizations. Just take a moment to look at some of the organizations and types of organizations on this list. These are huge organizations, global and local, and they all have one thing in common, right? They're doing great things for our economy and our society. However, in 2020, they were all victims to the Blackbaud ransomware. So Blackbaud, who's a software company, experienced a ransomware attack, and that hit local. St. Boniface Hospital Foundation, University of Manitoba, among other local companies, were affected. These breaches are hitting really close to home, and unfortunately, no one is immune, right? For most people now, it's a matter of when, not if. And if we fast forward to this year, we could do a whole presentation on COVID and remote work changes, but there's been some significant breaches and vulnerabilities causing those in the first 3 quarters so far. Microsoft's own Hafnium, which essentially is their Exchange proxy shell vulnerability, affected over 30,000 organizations in the States alone. In 2021, it was the 8th instance of a nation-state cyber attack against civil, local businesses and organizations. This initially started off with the ability to run commands, potentially make other changes in your organization, but all of these attacks, they're brought together in their daisy chain. The attackers took the Exchange vulnerability and turned it into a means to apply ransomware. And not just 3 weeks ago, we had a contact reach out for assistance with recovering from ransomware related to Exchange. Then we have Facebook and Microsoft. Like all the names on this list in previous slides, we have one thing in common that we need to do a better job of together, and that's we need to find and fix misconfigurations and find and fix vulnerabilities before the bad guys do. Another reminder about third-party software on-premise, not just the cloud. The Accellion breach, caused by third-party software running internally in your organization, was because of software that was not kept up to date. When patches are released, now more than ever, we have to stay on top of those and apply them in a timely fashion. Today's presentation isn't necessarily, entirely focused on ransomware, but it's really important to mention because every year ransomware attacks increase, and in particular with breaches, right, they are indeed related. The automatic funds transfer system mentioned here is one of many, but breaches are stemming from ransomware attacks, right? Ransomware is going to either hold your data hostage, and if you don't pay, right, that data is going to be leaked. So they're very much related, and they're increasing even more so this year. And this is a very interesting recent stat. It's estimated that a business will fall victim to ransomware every 11 seconds. I had to look at that twice when updating this presentation and doing the research. There's impact to, of course, financial, reputational, moral loss that we'll talk about a little bit later in this presentation. But now we're talking about human life. A hospital was ransomwared, affecting their monitoring systems, and it was unfortunately the root cause of a death of an infant. So this is real stuff. From a monetary insurance perspective, ransomware, single-handedly, ransomware is increasing third-party risk and insurance premiums. This time of year seems to be a renewal time for many people and even some of our own customers, and we're seeing either customers being declined or their premiums increasing 5-fold, generally because of the lack of 4 main components. That's regular security awareness training, so we have to be training people more than just at hire, lack of multi-factor, lack of segmenting our networks. So if sensitive data is on this network, not every device should be talking to it in your system. And backups, not just taking a backup, but testing recoveries, and making sure that your backup data is actually isolated so ransomware can't get to it. We'll talk more about that a little bit later. Tyson alluded to the frameworks and guidance out there. We ourselves, we practice what we preach, and we are assessing against, following, implementing CIS. Another great resource is NIST's recent ransomware guidance. Their ransomware risk management profile really gets into the defensive measures and essentially is an update to the community defense model from CIS. Regardless of the framework chosen, they're all basic preventative steps that every organization should take to protect themselves against ransomware. A lot of the items on the list and what we're going to talk about today, they really are considered basic cyber hygiene that everyone should do. Sharing some of the recommended protections from both NIST and CIS's guidance, regardless of the article, the framework, they all really come back to these really key activities and points. Number one, of course, backing up your data, securing the backup data itself, and isolating it in an offsite location. We've seen entire sites, including workstations, ransomware, and if your backup server is ransomed, you're either not getting that data back or the time to get it back is significantly longer. And that really could shift, your business being down from days to weeks. We want to collect and store audit logs and analyze them. Unfortunately, many organizations, even the big organizations with large budgets, they collect the logs, but they don't do anything with them. They're not looking at them. They're not analyzing them. We want to create an incident response plan. Ideally, you're going to have a high-level generic plan, and then you're going to have incident-specific plans, such as a ransomware response plan. Education is key. We need to train our employees, and it has to be more than just once and more than just once every couple of years. As mentioned, we want to keep our applications, particularly third-party applications and operating systems, up to date. We want to segment our networks, particularly in the age of Internet of Things and many other devices, We just can't connect everything to the same network and have everything talk to each other. We really need to isolate sensitive data and sensitive systems. Of course, we want to use antivirus, anti-malware software. We really need to move away from traditional signature-based antivirus software because they can only protect against the known bad stuff to more advanced endpoint detection and response, ideally with automated response options as well. We want to use DNS and web filtering. The bad guys will register a new domain name, such as badguy.com. We want to make sure that our clients, if they accidentally click on something, etc., aren't going to these bad sites that are going to deliver other payloads or ransomware. And a really important one, and this last point has been around for years and years, but unfortunately, organizations still aren't doing this, is we have to stop running day-to-day as an admin. We need to use regular user accounts, when we're checking our email, browsing the web, never do so as an admin. And that includes, a typical local administrator or a cloud application administrator like a Microsoft 365 global admin account. There certainly are other layers of defense, just answering on the fly here, Dalton's question. From a basic ransomware protection perspective, you're right, application whitelisting isn't on there. From a CIS perspective, that is more of a medium to advanced or implementation group 2 or 3 item. Application whitelisting would be an extra layer of protection, certainly valuable as well. And that means only allowing certain programs or DLL or scripts to run. Only authorized programs could run. So let's talk about third-party risk. Essentially, failure to assess third-party risk exposes us to data breaches, reputational damage, financial damage, supply chain attacks, and more. We really have to ask ourselves, how much is our reputation worth? How long would it take to rebuild your finances and repair your reputation if you were down for days, weeks, or longer? In a lot of spaces, a single cybersecurity incident could take a business down entirely. So third-party risk management is really about analyzing and controlling those risks associated with your service providers and third-party vendors. We have to do our due diligence. We need to determine the suitability of third parties, assess their security policies, procedures, frameworks, and more. We really need to know and be able to trust them that they can keep data secure. In a recent CyberAngel study, they found that 90% of data breaches are due to negligence that might have been prevented with cybersecurity training, processes, procedures, and tools, and more. Really what they're saying is 90% of cybersecurity breaches are because people are not doing, those basic cyber hygiene items. A few real-life examples include, new employees or existing foregoing security procedures, to get the job done quicker. IT employees, even power users, but IT employees get involved in shadow IT activities, running third-party applications that may be untrusted, using old tools that may have been victim to a supply chain attack, right? This is a responsibility of everyone, users, decision makers, IT people. And particularly in the cloud area, third-party vendors are leaving cloud buckets or servers open with sensitive documents easily exposed. Whether it's Microsoft Azure Storage or Amazon AWS, just the default in some cases of a public storage bucket, they're scanned for and they're found in seconds. So there's a lot of risks obviously that we have to plan for and deal with. Risk typically falls into, these four main categories of financial, legal, operational, and reputational. Third-party breaches and outages, right, could damage your revenue and reputation. From a legal perspective, a third party could impact your compliance with certain legislation or regulation requirements. When you outsource, that doesn't necessarily mean the end of your responsibility. The third party could very well be responsible for the infrastructure and servers, power, internet that's traditionally was in your data center, but you're still responsible for securing data, training users, and more. And operational, right? Down systems are going to have a significant impact on your business. If you rely on vendors, like in the Blackbaud example, right? When there's a vendor outage, right, you're at their whim. In a lot of cases, during an incident, particularly with a data breach, these risks are going to overlap, and unfortunately, you're going to be impacted by two or more of the risks on this slide. As mentioned, frameworks can help, right? Frameworks can be leveraged to evaluate and manage your risk. We're going to focus on CIS today. As ourselves, we advise on CIS best practices, we assess against them, and follow and implement them ourselves. I just want to take a quick moment to talk about the design principles behind CIS and why they really are realistic, applicable, and more. CIS uses offense to inform the defense. So the controls are selected and, more importantly, prioritized based on knowledge of attacker behavior and attacker patterns. CIS, you can't do everything, and you can't cover off every single checklist from every single framework. So CIS helps you focus on the most critical things to stop the most common relevant attacks. Particularly when we're talking about basic cyber hygiene, all of the CIS recommendations, they're meant to be practical and specific. Everything in CIS is measurable, so you can show using hard numbers and quantitative guidance, right? You can show your security posture improvement over time, and you could target improvements in certain areas and have numbers backing that. So those numbers and progress can be easily reported to management, boards, etc., to show current state, gaps, your progress, and more. And one of the probably most underrated top benefits of CIS is how it plays nicely and maps to other frameworks. CIS maps to NIST, ISO, PCI, MITRE, and more. There's about 25 to 30 frameworks that you can map to. What that means is if you do an assessment of your environment, or of any of the benchmarks that CIS provides, you can take that assessment and map it over to NIST as an example without reassessing from scratch. Your alignment to NIST can be documented, in hours instead of reassessing over days. CIS version 8 came out this past May and now includes 18 controls and over 150 safeguards. There is a control specifically for managing and covering service providers. Before we talk about the service provider specific control, I just want to look at the elements of the CIS controls for those not familiar with CIS. Each control includes a description of the intent of the control. It talks about, why is this important? So it describes the importance of applying these safeguards in blocking, mitigating, or identifying attacks. Specific procedures and tools are described, right? So this is going to be a combination of the people, process, and technology used to implement the safeguards and descriptions of each. The safeguard and control set in particular that we're focusing on today is Control 15, which is service provider management. Its intention is to develop a process to evaluate service providers who hold your sensitive data and hold them responsible, to manage and secure that critical infrastructure they may be, managing and providing you with. If you look at the bottom of this slide, there's 3 implementation groups, IG1, IG2, and IG3. Every CIS control has essentially levels or implementation groups. Anywhere you see IG1, that is your basic cyber hygiene. Typically, organizations will assess against and remediate the implementation group 1 safeguards, then move on to 2, then 3. This could be done in different amount of time depending on the budget and resources available. And it's very common that an organization tackles IG1 in year 1, group 2 in year 2, etc. So why is service provider management important? As mentioned, right, we rely on vendors and partners to help manage our data and secure that data, in addition to running core applications and infrastructure for us. I mentioned this on an earlier slide, right? The buck doesn't stop there, right? So privacy regulations, legal obligations, they extend to third parties, right? We just can't, shift the blame and responsibility to them. It just doesn't happen that way automatically. In terms of governance, risk, and compliance, third-party trust is a core function. And it's very common these days that, that third party is probably contracting with someone else to provide those services to you.
And sorry, and on that one, this is one of those items that goes both ways. This is both an important thing for you to have in your own organization for the third parties that you work with, but it also starts to get the mind thinking and going through the necessary steps within your organization for whatever services you're providing to other organizations. So where you're a third party to someone else. So the purpose of going through this is both to protect yourself from your third parties, but also what you can do to improve wherever you are a third party to another organization.
Absolutely. So we'll talk about the specific safeguards, but let's just do an overview of the specific procedures and tools. Ideally, you'd have a centralized platform for managing contract documentation. In your contracts, whether it's at renewal or while establishing a new service rate, you want to have language in your contracts to hold service providers accountable. Whether that's from a service perspective, it also should be included from a security perspective. This means establishing a policy for reviewing your providers, and that really starts with an inventory of them, assigning risk ratings and classification to them. You need to document impact, if that service provider is out of business, disappears, etc. The procedures and tools should be revisited at least annually or when significant changes are made to your environment. But more importantly, threats change daily, right? So, and this applies to all of the CIS safeguards, right? And that's where they do a great job of prioritizing them based on real world threats, because it's going to change our defensive actions required. And this can't, be mentioned enough. Really, really key is decommissioning activities. So when ending a contract with a service provider, right, we have to think about any user and service accounts that were created, disabling them. Looking at data flows, are you sending data to that service provider in automatic means? So, disabling that automation. And really at the end of the day, right, how do you securely dispose of that data? And this is really specific to contracts, but at the end of the contract, right, who owns the data, right? And how does that data, get back to you, right? How does the control return to you for that particular set of data? So looking at the particular safeguards, like a few other CIS controls, right? It's really about starting with an inventory. If you related to assets, right? If you don't know what you have in your environment, how are you going to protect it? So the first safeguard is establishing an inventory of your service providers. It's really important that each service provider has a primary contact. That is key. Then we get into establishing a service provider management policy. So that means taking that inventory, assessing each provider, for their criticality and importance to you, and then establishing future processes for, assessing them, monitoring them, holding them accountable, and at some point possibly decommissioning them. All of these safeguards should be updated and reviewed on a yearly basis or when significant changes are made. The classification part is key, and it's really about data. So when you go to classify your providers, you need to look at, what type of data are they holding? How sensitive is that data? How much is there? What are the data flows in and out of that service provider? Depending on location of that service provider, right? What are the applicable regulations in addition to your own responsibilities? It's really performing a mini risk assessment on them and then classifying them accordingly. And then we get into contract language. So historically, contracts have included service level agreements, based on performance. We really need to shift that to add and include security requirements. That could mean minimum security requirements, such as, you must follow NIST or CIS. And really key, because again, right, it's not a matter of if. Unfortunately, when something happens, right, what are your requirements for response time? How's that data going to be protected? Do you need to encrypt it? And what do you do at the end in terms of disposal and securely handing that data back? Then we get into actually assessing. And I'm going to back up a slide here. So just connecting the dots with implementation groups. You can see from implementation group 1, which is in green, that's your basic cyber hygiene, right? Having an inventory of your service providers. Then you get into policy, which is group 2. Having a policy, classifying your providers, adding that contract language are group 2 items. And then implementation group 3 gets into the actual assessment of. Now, depending on the vendor and size of the vendor, you might be able to ask them for certain reports, such as a service organizational control report. Typically, that's for larger enterprises. If you are required to follow PCI, you can ask them for a attestation of compliance report. But it generally starts with customized questionnaires and other interview style assessments, which we're going to talk about later. And then we want to monitor them. So once you have written your service provider management policy, once you've started to assess them, right, you need to keep them honest and monitor that relationship. And really key, the last safeguard is the secure decommissioning process. This goes back, many years, right? But there was Target, many other third-party breaches were simply because, user accounts were left behind. User accounts were left behind with weak passwords or default passwords. So we really need to consider determination, which accounts were set up, what rights do they have? Are there any automatic data flows, as I mentioned before? So typically, When we start with assessing our vendors and suppliers, it really starts with this high-level process and a questionnaire. So start by selecting a management framework such as CIS. With CIS in particular, you want to start with the first implementation group 1, and that's the inventory of your providers, and then work your way through the group 2 items. Classify the service providers based on the sensitive data they hold belonging to you. When you have the opportunity to, at renewal or renegotiation, right, make sure you're including security requirements into those contracts and updating your policy. Then you start with a questionnaire. So have your service provider complete a questionnaire, and it can't just stop there. So we want to, in response to their answers, right, we want to request evidence and reports. We want them to show factual evidence, that they're actually doing what they say they're supposed to be doing. And that's part of monitoring and reassessing them. And again, if needed, right, we want to securely decommission our providers. And all of these steps, all of these process should be updated, at least annually, or when renewals or significant changes occur. Quite often when you reach out to vendors with this type of questionnaire, you either get vague answers or a, the red flag throws up when they answer yes to everything without detail. So you really got to be mindful of that response and try and get more. But we're going to talk about these again from the perspective of starting with a simple questionnaire. It can't just be internet research and just, taking somebody's word for it. Assessing third parties and ensuring they're protecting your data, meeting your regulations, requirements, etc. It has an impact on cyber insurance as well. So these organizations that you're going to assess, they're used to these questions, whether it be from other customers or, their own cyber insurance applications. And this applies to you as well, whether it's your own organization or that service provider. The ability to satisfy a potential customer in these type of questionnaires about security posture is going to make or break a deal. So we just wanted to share with you some common and recommended questions that, generally speaking, most reliable vendors should be able to answer without, deflection, hesitation, vagueness, or pushback. So under the theme of kind of an organizational wide security mindset, ask, are they following a specific security framework? Do they have up-to-date security policies? How are they actually enforced and monitored? How often are they updated? Are employees receiving regular training? And again, this training has to be more often, than just at hire. In terms of protecting your data, pose questions like, do you have a data classification process, i.e., data is either confidential, private, or public? Does the organizations have any means to detect data loss prevention? And really, it all boils down to how sensitive data is protected, right? So once you determine the sensitivity level of data, are the mechanisms for ingesting data, managing data, processing, storing data, are they enough and equivalent to the security controls required? Is that organization encrypting data? Everyone generally these days is encrypting data while it's moving, but is that encryption happening when the data is at rest in their, server rooms in country XYZ? And from an access perspective to that data, right, are they using, the basic concepts of least privilege and need to know? Again, using cloud apps and cloud infrastructure, yes, the responsibility for, the hardware, etc., is theirs, but the responsibility of protecting data and customer data is still ultimately yours. CIS evaluates these safeguards and global best practice recommendations based on more than just technology. It truly is about people, process, and technology. So there's some people and process items to consider. As I mentioned, right, security is everyone's responsibility. People, even IT people, are the weakest link, right? So everything needs to be driven by policy, procedures, supporting documentation, training, and of course technology. So are they performing regular access reviews? Are they using MFA, multi-factor, wherever possible? What are the new hire and termination procedures? Are they collecting logs? Is there an audit trail? Whether it's an application-specific audit trail or logs being shipped to a central location, is actually somebody monitoring and looking at those logs, and looking for strange behavior, oddities, etc. Regarding backup, are backups being performed? Are they automatic? How often? Are they keeping their applications and software up to date? Do they have a BC and disaster recovery plan? You should have your own, and the service provider should have one of their own as well. Is it actually updated? Is it tested? In some organizations, there's a need to keep legacy or unsupported software. So how is that handled? Is there documented exceptions? Is there protection in terms of isolation, segmentation? For backup specifically, how are they isolating your data? Are they being isolated and protected from lateral movement or ransomware? And again, testing backups are key. Too many people just set the backup and forget. From a secure configuration perspective, are our assets and services hardened? It's changing default passwords, disabling unnecessary services, really reducing that security footprint. And what resources, what tools are they using to guide that? And checklists from the internet necessarily don't cut it, right? So they should be using a platform like CIS that provides benchmarks and build kits to ensure secure configuration. I'm going to hand it back to Tyson to talk about our own journey with CIS.
Thanks, John. So just to give you an idea of what we've done as an organization and where we're progressing when it comes to cybersecurity and the risk that we could potentially provide to our customers and what we've done to mitigate that risk. So we have performed a complete CIS assessment, and including third-party risk to the providers that provide us services. And we've actually been going through over the last 6 months remediating items out of that list, and we're continuing through that process. We're actually subscribed to our own virtual information security officer service, where John is on a regular basis reviewing a number of security items monthly, quarterly, semi-annually, and annually as per guidance of a number of cybersecurity frameworks to ensure that we're staying on top of our cybersecurity. I've just gone through updating a number of policies, including our employee policies and our internal use policies with layered safeguards and a number of heightened levels of protection. And then we produced our own vendor risk statement, so it's clear and defined to our customers what risk level exists. We've implemented a number of advanced cybersecurity tools, including enhanced endpoint detection response, protecting our own endpoints, and then real-time security incident and event management monitoring service, both backed by 24/7 security operations centers. So we've implemented a good majority and are working our way through implementing that which we recommend customers do based on where they score on a CIS assessment. So a lot of work has been done by our organization over the last year. We're already at the point where any of our customer data related systems that can be accessed externally are all two-factor authentication protected. So there is no access to any customer data or customer systems by our own staff or by any customers that isn't two-factor protected. And then we are just finishing up on putting two-factor authentication in place internally in our own network to take that to the furthest extent. So we're very close to being 100% two-factor authentication method across the board for every single system we access within our environment, and then every single system that helps support our customers as well. So We're taking security very seriously. We've invested a lot of time, money, and energy into security to protect ourselves and to protect our customers. And what we've learned with what we've done with other customers, what we've done with ourselves is really what we're bringing forward to our customer base. And obviously, based on the assessment and what's important to the organization, building a proper security roadmap coming out of those assessments. Cybersecurity and cybersecurity planning, it's not a thing that maybe you'll think about doing at some point anymore. If your organization isn't doing it, you're at risk, and you're at a heightened risk because you're not. So it's moved away from something that's a nice to have or a maybe you should do. It's now becoming a requirement. As John mentioned earlier, from a cyber insurance perspective, we have seen cyber insurance rates increase dramatically. It's often dependent on the industry organizations are in and the services they provide. We had one customer that went from a $2,500 a year cybersecurity cost for their premium to recently being quoted almost $20,000 a year in a 1-year increase. And then when they went to get competitive quotes from others, because their security posture was not mature enough, they were denied by others. So they've had no choice but to go with the provider they were already with at a much higher price. And not only did the price go up, they actually reduced the amount of coverage that they're getting. So they're paying more, they're getting less coverage, and the only way they can get to a service that provides either a better cost and or better coverage is to start implementing more cybersecurity practices and procedures and policies and tools within their own environment. So it's really across the board. Third-party risk is an important part of that for sure, and we've done a lot to help protect ourselves and our customers. So, now's a great time to open the floor up to questions or discussions. If there's anything that you want to ask about, if there's any, suggestions you have or ideas, or you want to understand how this applies to your organization, please don't hesitate to raise your hand. If you want to have an audio conversation, we'd love to be an open, dynamic conversation. If you're not as comfortable with that and you just want to chat or send a question in or a comment in, please feel free to do that via the text-based chat built into the application as well. So the floor is open. Please feel free to ask any questions. Oh, I've got one gentleman typing. No problem. Thank you for attending. Really appreciate it. We do have a couple of questions that some people had submitted ahead of time. So I'll go through, I'll ask John a couple of those questions. And one question is, how do most vendors respond when you go to the vendor and ask them for, an understanding of what their cybersecurity state is? And do you get pushback? Do most organizations respond with positive information? Pardon me.
Yeah, that's interesting. So that's changed a lot over the years. So, a few years ago, when less organizations had cyber insurance or needed it, or, nowadays, right, to do business with others, it's a requirement in some cases. So years ago, we kind of accepted vague answers or short reports, but nowadays, right, most organizations, they're used to it, whether it's cyber insurance related or the cost of doing business. Organizations today are more used to having to respond to these requirements. However, it's still really important to be wary of, vague answers, yes, with no explanation to everything. But generally overall, there's been a lot more openness in sharing these days.
We have someone typing a question right now.
Well, that comes through. We did this presentation earlier, so I do have a few questions from our first session, and one of them was, what's in scope and who should I include? So it's really about starting with vendors who either have remote access to your environment, vendors that host sensitive data, vendor software that touches your sensitive data. So, think about remote access and who ultimately has a touch on the data. We had someone share a point about vendor assessments. So they've been using a vendor assessment form for a while. I definitely agree with this. Some are better than others. Some provide details. Some are very vague, as mentioned. So it really is important to follow up, right? Push back for evidence, push back for more information. It's really key to hold them accountable, and this should be a two-way relationship, right? So you got to be mindful of that, but you do want to get evidence, solid answers. How is what they're doing mapping to best practices or a framework?
Yeah, absolutely. And, it's not that common yet in some industries, but it's becoming more common in more industries. And it's getting to the point where it probably won't be too long before it's very common in most industries. It's evolving very quickly. The last year has really changed a lot. And cyber insurance has been a big part of that. That one customer we mentioned that was, struggling with getting, a reasonable cost for their cyber insurance, when they did their application 2 years ago, we helped them fill out a one-page form of questions about cybersecurity. And then for some reason for the renewal last year, they just reused that same document. We made minor updates, and then the document that they got this year was 10 pages that we had to go through. So it's a much more rigorous questions about their own environment and their third-party risk and what they had done. So it's starting to come again into the cyber insurance world as well.
This is a related and was a really interesting question from last time, but who ultimately is accountable and responsible? And at the end of the day, it really is business leadership and management, or the board if a board is involved. IT needs everyone's help, right? It's not just a technical problem, so everyone has to participate in showing due care and due diligence.
Yeah, there's another comment that, a great gatekeeping question with any vendor that you're working with is what is their email filtering and email protection? And if they don't have some level of advanced email protection filtering, something that's checking the links that are in emails, something that's checking, any attachments in emails, not just very simple basic spam, but real-time advanced security screening and scanning of the content of emails, that's definitely a great reason to maybe look to a different vendor or supplier or customer even that has that, because that can be a pretty high risk. If you're an organization you're doing a lot of email communication with, their email security is going to be critical to your own security. We've actually seen a case in Manitoba of an organization whose email was compromised. And when their email was compromised, the bad actor was smart enough to not change the password on the account they compromised, and they started masquerading as that user to that user's customers, and were actually able to extract money from the compromised user's customers because the customers didn't realize they weren't talking to the person they thought they were talking to, because all the communication was happening by email. That organization that got compromised, they didn't have advanced filtering, they didn't have multi-factor authentication, and they certainly weren't doing any sort of a verbal or follow-up process by telephone or by third-party checking of any kind of the communication that was happening with their own customers. And yeah, it was a significant event that happened for that organization. So, as great as all the technology solutions are, sometimes it's just about having good business processes in place as well. And, making sure that you're following up when things change with your customers, and, putting a process in place, with your customers or with your vendors for communication of changes. You know, email is as if you're technical, you know, and you're on this call, you know that email is not in any way safe or secure. It's actually one of the least secure and least safe ways to communicate. It's basically akin to writing something on a piece of paper and throwing it at someone. And if you're lucky enough that they catch it and they open it up and they read it, great, but you have no idea who it was thrown by. You have no idea what they put on that piece of paper. You have no idea what you're going to get when you open it up. And that's what the big problem with email is. And yet it's the primary form of a lot of intercompany business today in the modern world, and it's a high risk for that. So that's definitely a good point. Email is a serious concern. So having good email security practice in place, and if there's organizations, third parties that you do a lot of email transactions with, and they're financial or, you know, secure business data related, you should consider doing secure email transfer with them, where those emails are encrypted and digitally signed, so you know that they're coming from and going to the right people, and that's not that difficult to set up. So there's those options to help protect your data that way as well. You know, when you're dealing with companies that you're sending data to, whether it be to web-based reporting systems or, you know, web-based purchasing or invoicing systems, you know, you want to make sure that that transfer of data is set up securely. It's, you know, encrypted, it's protected. The systems that are receiving that data are, you know, properly set up at the other end. So, you know, if you're going to set up a online purchasing or online transaction system for your customers for whatever it is that you do, and you're using a third party to provide that for you, you should definitely take that third party to task on what security, backups, protection they have, because now you're potentially putting your data and your customers' data, and therefore potentially your customers, at risk for a system you don't control, but at the end of the day, you're responsible for, because you're the one that introduced it to your customers. So that's where, you know, that responsibility message that John just talked about is it's really not a responsibility of IT. And helping business understand that security is not a responsibility of IT is critical. And that's something that, you know, we can come in and help have that conversation with business, because data protection, data management, and, you know, all of that, they can say it's IT's responsibility all they want, but at the end of the day, if you get a breach, not IT's that's going to be at the biggest risk. It's going to be the senior executive that's going to be at the biggest risk to explain to customers, shareholders, business partners, whoever it might be, what happened and why. I mean, Enns Brothers got compromised this year. I got the email as a customer of them telling me that they had been compromised. There was not a whole lot of detail as to what the compromise was, so I happened to know just through the industry what happened, but they got hit pretty hard, and a significant outage from it. So, and a part of that was then their third-party relationships with some of their vendors that they work with got strained quite heavily because of that event as well. So, you know, if you do get breached, there's also the third-party aspect of protecting yourself from third-party risk, but also if you get breached, what risk do you present to the vendors that you work with? And that's something that's very important to be considering, and, you know, building out in your planning for security as well. What can you do to mitigate any risk or damage to any upstream providers or any organizations that you have a business-to-business relationship with, so that you're not in breach of any contracts or putting them at risk in any way? So it really is full circle. You know, there's the part of evaluating those that are providing service to you, but it's also critical that you're evaluating what service you're providing to others and the risk that goes with those services.
Yeah, with the attention that cybersecurity is getting these days, insurance, you know, generally speaking, we're in it together. So these third parties are going to be a little more keen to, you know, work together, show improvements together, because, you know, both parties don't want to be in the news or suffer significant loss.
Any other questions or any other comments from anyone? We're just coming up on the last couple of minutes, so if anyone has anything else they wanted to add or any other questions they wanted to ask, please feel free to do so. John, I think someone asked a question earlier. I think you mentioned about how to, who is in scope and what's in scope. But another question that was asked previously is how do you classify and prioritize vendors? And, it's worth mentioning that really the first step is, look for the most critical processes. They're likely going to be accounting related processes. Those are going to be the ones that you want to protect the most because that's where the most risk potentially exists. Look at the vulnerability or threats that are potentially, at risk from that business process and that third party, relationship that you have with that organization. Then, look at the impact of what can happen if there is a compromise based on that system or that relationship, and then evaluate what controls you can put in place and then apply those controls is really the right way to move forward with that. So really starts with that evaluation process and, starting, with your own business processes and understanding which data within those business processes are the ones that put you potentially at risk. If you need help with any of this, our call to action is, reach out to either of us, to your account manager, to whoever you deal with on a regular basis at Broadview Networks. If you don't have anyone you deal with, call any of us. It's perfectly fine. We can help you prepare your vendor questionnaire, and we can help you with either an implementation group 1 or a more advanced cyber security assessment if that's what fits your organization, so that you can get prepared for this. Because we provide this as a service because it's a part of what we do. But I know for John and over the last year working with John, he's made it more of a passion for me because these are preventative activities that are happening to people, and it's really not happening because of things that can't be prevented for the most part. So we want to help you set up that prevention as much as possible. Thanks everyone for your time. Really appreciate it. Hope everyone has a great weekend. It's going to be nice and warm still, so it looks like summer's going on for quite a while this year. So please get out and enjoy. Thanks everyone. Appreciate it. Thanks, John.
Thank you. Thank you.